"I didn't mean to hurt her," he said, moments before the detectives revealed a brutal truth he could no longer deny. For hours, he insisted it was an accident, yet every choice he made after that night spoke otherwise. How does a man forget the weight of a body, or the silence of the woods where he left it? Under the pale glow of a weak autumn moon, the clearing was silent. The air hung cold, damp with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. Somewhere beneath the heavy weight of 2 cut logs, a slender hand reached upward, frozen, fingers caked in mud. The body beneath had been there for months, pressed into the soil, its features barely recognizable. Blood had long since seeped away, absorbed by the ground, but the violence lingered in every detail. Torn fabric, twisted limbs, a fractured jaw, as though something had beaten her again and again, even after life had left her. Such a scene does not happen by chance. No, this was a choice. The placement of the body, the deliberate concealment, the cruel precision. The one who left her here had wanted her to disappear, and for a time, it seemed they had succeeded. But long before that bleak discovery, there had been a different night. It was late October. Halloween drew near, and in a field outside Monroe County, a crowd had gathered beneath string lights and bonfires. Music throbbed in the distance, mixed with laughter and the clink of bottles. Costumes of every shape moved in the shadows. Witches, monsters, caped heroes. Among them was Chelsea Bruck, 22 years old. Dressed as poison ivy, leaves sewn carefully onto a green bodysuit, a violet wig framing her face. Witnesses later recalled her smile, her excitement for the night. She'd come with friends, planning to meet others. Yet, as the hours slipped past, those friends began to drift away. One by one, they left, and Chelsea remained. Some said she was too intoxicated to notice. Others, that she had insisted on staying, certain she would find a way home. But in those dark hours after midnight, her world narrowed. No phone, no wallet, no ride. Just the flickering shadows of strangers and the bite of cold air. It is in moments like this, isolation, vulnerability, that certain predators find their chance. Not the methodical serial killer of fiction, but an opportunist, one driven by impulse, by sudden craving for power. Daniel Clay was such a man. On the surface, ordinary. A history of petty crimes, substance abuse. No overt signs of extreme violence, yet beneath a need for control, a disregard for boundaries. A man who, when presented with a situation like this, would act not with empathy, but with possession. At the party, witnesses saw Chelsea near the bonfire, alone, crying softly, makeup smeared, asking strangers for a phone. Then, a man approached. Dark hair, glasses, lean build. He spoke with her, stayed close. One witness remembered. He held her arm as if steadying her. Or perhaps not. They were last seen walking toward the parking area. No one followed. No one heard a struggle. Yet minutes can be enough. In that brief window, the trajectory of a life can be changed forever. What happened in the hours that followed is not fully known, but the aftermath speaks clearly. A brutal assault, the tearing of fabric, the breaking of bone, a frenzy of violence that suggests escalation, rage ignited by resistance, or perhaps by the thrill of dominance itself. Then, the cold calculation, the body transported, hidden beneath logs, in a place where wind and rain might erase the crime. But even such efforts cannot silence what the earth remembers. Months later, when the bulldozer scraped across that forgotten soil, the truth began to rise, and with it, the hunt for the one who had buried their guilt beneath the mud. But that is only the beginning. What followed would reveal far more about the mind that chose violence and the lies built to escape its shadow. It was a gray morning in late April when the call came in. The property off Briar Hill Road had been under slow construction for months. The owner, John Markin, had been moving dirt from another site, preparing the uneven ground for a new foundation. That day, one of the haulers dumped another load, and as the bulldozer pushed forward, something refused to give beneath the blade. John thought it was debris at first, a tarp, perhaps, or old trash buried long before. But as the dirt shifted, a pale curve emerged, bone and hair, human. The officers who arrived later would describe the scene in hushed voices. The body lay in a shallow depression, the earth damp and cold around it. Twisted remnants of a costume still clung to the limbs, green fabric stained dark. Ivy leaves faded and torn. One shoe was missing. The other, barely visible, lay nearby, red and scuffed. Over the torso, 2 cut logs had been placed deliberately, one longer, clean at the ends, as if chosen, not merely fallen from the woods. The air hung heavy with the scent of wet soil, decay, and something sharper, a metallic trace that lingered despite the months that had passed. This was no accident, no random death. The way the body had been left told a different story. Someone had tried to bury what they had done, not with care, but with the cold pragmatism of a mind that feared discovery. By the time the coroner's team began their careful work, the first call had already gone out to the family. The missing person case that had haunted them for 6 long months was no longer a search. It was now something else. Dental records confirmed what the heart already knew. Chelsea Bruck had been found. The autopsy revealed more than identity: multiple fractures to the jaw, severe trauma to the face, bruising along the arms and torso, signs of a violent encounter, and of defensive wounds, small but telling. She had fought. But against what, or whom? That question remained. The investigators returned to the scene again and again, sifting through every inch of disturbed ground. Nearby, they found tape, a cigarette butt, and, half hidden beneath the bulldozer's path, a single synthetic ivy leaf. For weeks after, the case moved in slow circles. The party had drawn hundreds. Many had been drinking, some too heavily to recall much at all. Witnesses remembered Chelsea, alone, distressed, asking for a phone. Then, with a man unknown to most, a vague description was pieced together. Flyers went out. A composite sketch followed, but no name. Not yet. It was the costume that finally spoke. Traces of DNA were recovered from the torn fabric. A profile entered into the national database. The match, when it came, pointed to a man already in the system. Daniel Clay, a petty criminal, in and out of local jails for theft, drugs. At the time of the search, he was already being held for unpaid child support. His history suggested instability, a tendency toward impulsive acts, but nothing, until now, that matched the brutality of this crime. Yet the evidence was there. His DNA on her costume, in places consistent with force. And so, the next chapter began. I have often observed, when a predator like Clay is cornered, their mask begins to slip. Not all at once, but in layers. What drives them is not just impulse, but ego. A belief that they can still control the narrative, that they can talk their way out. The interview room, though, has a different gravity. It draws truth out slowly, sometimes painfully. And what unfolded there in the hours to come would reveal far more than Clay ever intended to share. But that is a part of the story that must be told carefully. For in that small, stark room, beneath the hum of a single light, the true face of this crime began to emerge. The interview room was small, almost featureless. Pale walls, a single table, 2 chairs facing each other. In the corner, a camera watched silently. Daniel Clay sat with his arms crossed, shoulders slightly hunched. His eyes flicked from the tabletop to the detectives, then back again, restless, guarded. The air in the room seemed still, as though waiting. They began with small talk, a familiar tactic: build a bridge, create a rhythm. Let the suspects speak, let them settle, and listen to what they reveal without meaning to. Clay spoke easily at first. About the party, about drinking, about seeing people he knew. He claimed he had been there for a couple of hours, then left. Alone. The words came quickly, perhaps too quickly. When asked about Chelsea, he hesitated, said he might have seen her in passing. Maybe. He was not sure. She was not really his type, he added, with a small shrug. Dismissive. It is in moments like this that a certain pattern becomes clear. A distancing, an attempt to minimize, to control the narrative before the real questions begin. But they did begin. The detectives shifted, their tone soft but deliberate. They mentioned the DNA found on Chelsea's torn costume, found in areas that could not be explained by casual contact. The room seemed to tighten around him. Clay leaned forward slightly, hands now clasped. He blinked often, swallowed. "I do not know how it got there," he said. Then again, louder this time. "I swear." Yet the story began to shift. Slowly, perhaps he suggested. They had left the party together after all. Maybe she'd asked for a ride. His memory was not clear, he claimed. He had been drinking, but certain details could not be blurred. The injuries, the fabric torn with force, the deliberate attempt to hide her body beneath cut logs. These were choices, not accidents. As the hours passed, the mask continued to crack. Clay's voice faltered. His words grew slower, more fragmented. He admitted they had been together. He admitted something had happened. But beyond that, denial returned. He could not remember. It had not been intentional, he insisted. He had panicked. He had been afraid. I have seen this posture before, in other rooms, with other men. It is not true remorse, not accountability. It is self-preservation. A desperate hope that partial truths, wrapped in excuses, might somehow lessen what they have done. But the evidence spoke more clearly than he could. The pattern of the injuries, the force required, the positioning of the body. This was not panic alone. It was an assertion of dominance, followed by the cold logic of concealment, a predator's mind when stripped of its illusions. Clay sat in that room for hours more, shifting between fragments of truth and hollow denial. By the end, there was no confession in the fullest sense, but there was enough to see through the lies, enough to understand what had truly unfolded in those dark hours after the party. And outside that small room, in the wider world, a family waited, grieving not only for what had been lost, but now for the terrible clarity of how it had been taken. The trial would come in time, the verdict, the sentence. But in that interview room, beneath the soft hum of the camera, the heart of the case had already been laid bare. The courtroom was filled with a strange kind of silence. Not the absence of sound exactly, but a hush beneath every breath, every small movement. Rows of wooden benches lined the space, occupied by faces drawn tight with grief, with anger, with the brittle weariness of those who had waited too long for answers. Chelsea's family sat together, shoulders close, hands clasped. They had been here for every hearing, every delay, through months of legal motions and long, empty days. Now, at last, the trial had begun. Daniel Clay entered under escort, dressed in plain clothes but still marked by the weight of what had passed. He moved with a certain stiffness. His eyes flicked once toward the gallery, then dropped. The prosecution laid out their case with grim precision. The evidence was clear. DNA, torn fabric, the deliberate concealment of the body. Expert witnesses spoke to the severity of the injuries, to the force required to cause them. Not accidental, not panicked, intentional. And yet, throughout it all, Clay maintained his version. No memory, no clear intent. He had been drinking. He had been afraid. Words spoken flatly, without depth. I have often reflected on this. How some offenders, when faced with undeniable truth, retreat into a kind of hollow narrative. It is not true denial. It is self-preservation. A desperate attempt to cling to some fragment of control, but control was no longer his. The jury listened. They saw the photographs. They heard from Chelsea's friends, from her family, from the officers who had walked that cold, silent field where her body was found. And in the end, the weight of it could not be denied. The verdict came swift and unanimous. Guilty. First-degree murder. Life without parole. Clay showed little reaction. No outburst, no plea. Just a slight tightening of the jaw, as though bracing against a tide that could no longer be held back. Chelsea's family wept quietly. There was no triumph in it, no victory, only the solemn, hollow recognition of what justice could and could not give them. When the courtroom emptied and the press lights dimmed, the silence remained. The kind of silence that lingers in the bones long after words have ended. And in that silence, one truth endured. Chelsea had been stolen from them, not by chance nor by tragic accident, but by the deliberate choice of a man who saw in her not a person, but an opportunity. It is a pattern I have seen before, and will see again. Predators are not always the monsters we imagine. Often they wear the face of the ordinary, but beneath lies something colder. And though justice had now spoken, though the case was closed, the shadow of that night, and of what was lost within it, would never fully fade. In the months that followed the verdict, life in Monroe County seemed to settle again, at least on the surface. The field where Chelsea had been found grew over with tall grass and saplings. The earth, disturbed and scarred by the investigation, was slowly reclaimed by nature. But for those who had lived through it, who had touched the weight of that loss, nothing truly returned to what it had been. I visited that place once, long after the trial had ended. There was no marker, no trace of what had happened. Only the subtle sense of absence, lingering beneath the trees. The wind moved through the branches with a faint, restless sound, not unlike the low murmur that had filled the courtroom on the day of sentencing. Cases like this leave more than a record. They carve into the fabric of a community. They awaken a kind of fragile awareness that beneath the ordinary rhythms of life, darkness can move unseen. It does not always wear the face of a stranger. Sometimes it comes from the familiar, the one who smiles in passing, the one who blends into the crowd. Daniel Clay was not remarkable in any visible way, and perhaps that is what made him most dangerous. He was not driven by ideology, nor by long-nurtured plans. His violence was impulsive, reactive, but beneath it, a deeper thread ran. A need for control, a lack of empathy, an ability to see another person as less as an object to be used, discarded, and concealed. During the investigation, patterns emerged from his past, incidents dismissed at the time, aggression toward former partners, a history of disregard for consent, for boundaries. Not all of it documented but known to those who had been close to him. In these details, the deeper truth of his character took shape. And when the opportunity arose that night, when Chelsea, isolated and vulnerable, crossed his path, the choice was made, not in a sudden moment, but in a series of escalating acts, from approach to manipulation, to violence, to the cold, calculated effort to erase it all. Such escalation is common in offenders of this type. The initial act driven by impulse, the aftermath by fear of consequences. Yet even in fear, there is control. The choice to hide, to deceive, to deny. The refusal to confront the human weight of what they have done. In the end, Clay's attempts at denial failed. The evidence was too strong, the truth too persistent. But one cannot help but reflect on how easily it might have been different, had that DNA match not surfaced, had the body remained hidden a little longer. Justice, in this case, was the product of persistence, of forensic precision, and of the quiet courage of those who refused to let Chelsea's story fade into the shadows. Yet even with justice served, one truth remains. There is no closure in the way people often hope for. There is no undoing of that night, nor of the choices that led to it. For Chelsea's family, for those who knew her, the loss remains a living thing, woven into memory, into the shape of every day that follows. And for those of us who study such cases, who walk alongside these truths in our work, there is a quieter lesson, that beneath the ordinary, beneath the fragile comfort of what seems safe, there are always shadows, and it is in knowing them, in facing them clearly, that we honor those who can no longer speak for themselves. Chelsea's voice was silenced that night, but through the truth uncovered, through the memory held, it still echoes, and it must, always.